Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Tabak. I will moderate today's discussion on the topic of forgiveness in families. We're making this conversation shortly before Thanksgiving and thinking that in the coming weeks, families will gather during the holidays, people who live far apart and belong to different generations and see one another infrequently will spend time together. For some people, these reunions will be difficult. Some people might feel left out or choose not to participate. So we're going to try to explore today about how we can bridge some of these gaps and make these reunions more productive and happy. To help us with this discussion, I have three people with us today. Here is Randy Lyle, who is at Mount Mercy University. And Heather Erwin, who has an appointment at the University of Iowa. And Dick Socwell has a psychology practice here in Cedar Rapids. Some of these people have multiple roles, so I'm going to ask you to say a little bit about the several roles you have in our community, and then what brings you to our discussion today about this topic. So why don't you start, Randy?
All right. Well, my primary role is as program director at the Marriage and Family Therapy program. That's a master's degree and now a doctorate degree at Mount Mercy University. I teach in the different classes, provide live supervision for our both master's and doctoral level students. I'm also an ordained Episcopal priest and have been for 35 years. I preach on occasion at Christ Episcopal Church here in Cedar Rapids, and so have served in a variety of sort of spiritual priestly functions over the course of many years as well.
Did the religious vocation and the psychology therapy careers grow up together? Did one come before the other?
I began in the priesthood. Actually had intended to go into a PhD in philosophical theology.
Okay.
I got waylaid by deciding that we wanted to become missionaries, which my family and I went down to Argentina for 5 years. When we came back, I decided that I couldn't very well yank my family out again and go get another PhD in philosophical theology, and there were none at the time. I was living in Boone, Iowa. So marriage and family therapy, pastoral counseling was my second major in seminary, and there was a marriage and family therapy program at Iowa State University.
Yep.
So I ended up there, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Okay, now Heather, you're involved with educational policy.
Right.
You're working with people who are in prison, and you have a background in law. So tell us how all these things come together.
Yes, so my first hat is Senior Advisor to the Institute for Higher Education Policy, which is a DC-based policy organization. And my area of emphasis with that organization is on assisting marginalized populations, primarily those who are lacking access to higher education in prison. So my focus is on bringing college-level courses to students who are incarcerated. The second part of that hat is my affiliation with the University of Iowa's Liberal Arts Beyond Bars program, which is where we become proximate to those students and their needs, and actually facilitate the offering of courses for college credit through the University of Iowa at the Iowa Medical and Classification Center, otherwise known as Oakdale, in Coralville.
Okay. And Dick, describe your career and your contributions in our community.
Well, I'm a psychologist. I'm in private practice and been in this field over 40 years.
Okay.
And so I see folks with all sorts of difficulties, adults, adolescents, and at times children. Primarily with emotional difficulties such as depression, anxiety, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress, those sorts of things. I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, which means that I try to help people manage these emotions by learning how to take care of them on their own. And so I find it very rewarding. I'm almost 72, don't need to work, but I continue to work 3 days a week because I just really love what I do, because I love to see the kind of progress that people can make. So
Now, you're in a practice with several colleagues, is that right?
Yeah, there are about 20 folks in there between psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and so forth.
Okay, very good.
Mhm.
So I came to this subject thinking that in the news, I see a lot of rancor in debates involving people in the public eye. So some of this is people in public office, some of this is people in the news industry, the entertainment industry. I see it in the academic profession. I teach at Cornell College, and I wondered how much of this rancor is invading our personal lives, our family relationships. Do any of you share this feeling that something is changing and that what we see in the headlines in the news is affecting the way people interact one-to-one? You can disagree with me. You can all say no if you like, but let's start with that question. Anybody want to chime in?
I don't think there's any question, but this isn't a recent thing.
Okay.
It's a very long-standing thing, this decrease in tolerance, the ability for people to engage in a really disrespectful behavior toward others, this sort of narcissism about all that really matters is what I think. And I think this has been ongoing for a long, long time. There's been a significant uptick from my perspective in the past few years, but no, this is a long-standing thing. And I think people are just much less tolerant of other folks than they used to be.
Well, that forgiveness from history has apparently been with us always, or nearly always. And questions of, how do you do it, what does it mean, have always been a part of all of the cultures, around the world. All of the major religions have some sort of tradition for how they manage and do forgiveness, which I think supports what Dick was saying. This isn't anything new. We've always had to find a way to culturally and individually both offer and receive forgiveness in order to maintain some semblance of a cohesive culture and society. So I would agree with Dick that this isn't anything new. That being said, our ebb and flow of respect and civil discourse we're I think, for lack of a better word, we're at a low ebb right now.
And I'll add from my perspective, I think that is true in the community. I do see that very much in even in my own family interactions. Actually, we're fairly consolidated in our views and beliefs, but I do see tension in conversations that is much more readily bubbles to the surface. But when I think about the community in the prison environment, I think there's hopefulness in that all of the students inside acknowledge difficulties in their personal relationships with their family members that are on the outside, but also recognize that those are works in progress and come together in a new community and find better ways to communicate, and especially in a classroom, to find new and interesting ways to work through their differences so that they can get to a place where learning can be accomplished, so they have a common goal. So maybe it's a matter of finding a common goal more than seeking forgiveness.
Is there programming within prisons to help people reach out to their families, reconnect with families, find forgiveness, offer forgiveness? What is done there?
Yeah, I was actually thinking, as Dick was describing his work, that we primarily get, I think, the kids that slip through your cracks. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of men, which is the population that I work with, who have experienced trauma and neglect and victimization when they were children up through their adolescence and into adulthood, and that sometimes manifests in ways that are antisocial and land them in prison for a sentence of years. And I think when that happens, there are structures in place inside for people to receive counseling and therapy, and some of them are mandated by a sentence, like a judge will say you have to go through this specific. There's cognitive behavioral therapy. There are faith-based organizations that come in and teach anger management, for example, and parenting skills, and ways to break the cycles of abuse and neglect that tend to exist and manifest in families. And they work hard with each other and with those facilitators to reconnect with their family in meaningful ways. I just read a paper that one of the students wrote for a rhetoric class today, and he was talking about all the bad decisions he made and being in front of the judge at his sentencing and hearing his family kind of sobbing behind him and thinking, doing all of the negotiations with God and anybody else that would listen, and going back into that prison cell waiting to be transferred to where he would spend the next 15 years of his life and saying, how can I do better? This is not what I want to happen. And so those epiphanies happen at different stages for everybody, but they do tend to happen.
So are you working with families together typically, Dick? What is the nature of your...
I have a couple of sort of fundamental philosophies that I operate from in my practice. One of them is taking personal responsibility for your decision making. For about 40-some years, people have been coming in my office, and they always come in for the same reason. And that reason could be stated this way: I want to be happier. But when they tell me about all those things that they believe are getting in the way of them being happy, in every case, almost every one of them is something over which they have no control. I want my mother to treat me better. I want a better job. I want people. I want this. I want that. And what they're really saying is, I want the world to reformat itself so I can be happy. Well, guess what? That's not going to happen. We have control over very few things. That's what we need to focus on. Personally, what do I do? What do I say? How do I behave? So when we come to like these family get-togethers, I think the problem is not how the other people are behaving, although I may see that as I don't like it and so forth. But the problem comes in when I don't have tolerance. You see, you're going to behave differently than I am because of your background and your experiences and the beliefs and values that you have, and these drive your behaviors. And I may look at them and say, well, that's wrong. I don't see that as... That's not a problem. It becomes a problem when I bring emotion to it. When I decide that I'm going to tell you what I think in a rude way. And so then we have a conflict. By tolerating, that is, not making an issue out of it, I'm not saying that I accept it or I agree with it or I condone it. I'm simply saying, you're going to believe what you're going to believe. I can't think of a single argument I've had in my life, and there have been thousands, in which I convinced the other person that they were wrong and I was right. There's nothing I can say to you that's going to change your value and your belief. So why burden this with having this negative conflict? I'm going to accept it. You don't have to agree with me. We don't have to have the same values to be friends.
What are some of the principal challenges you see your students encounter as they try to enter this field to help others?
Well,
Okay.
Thousands, millions,
Okay.
unique to each one.
Okay.
Unlike Dick and traditional psychological practice, marriage and family therapists do work with the entire family or with
Okay.
the couple in session. That's our preferred way of working. Forgiveness comes up a lot as a topic, precisely because in a relationship, when it's sitting there in your room, and it's particularly in an intimate relationship, the inability to forgive the perceived harm that the other one has caused you. My spouse did something to me, had an affair, said something really mean-spirited, any of a number of possibilities, and I can't forgive that. I can't let that go. I need to find a way to make it fair or get justice. The psychological research on forgiveness tells us, first and foremost, a major mistake that we make, I think, in our culture all the time. The first issue of forgiveness is the wrong a big enough wrong to demand forgiveness? Right? We don't, that you voted for one person and I voted for another, and I think that yours is a dummy and you think mine is a dummy, and we yell at each other about that, is not a sin worthy of forgiveness. But we seem to have ratcheted up to think that it's at that level.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that I shouldn't be upset about these things?
Well, you
or
can
that
be
I shouldn't-
upset, but it's not a mortal wound,
Okay.
right? And forgiveness enters the picture when it's a mortal wound, for lack
Okay.
of a better way of saying it, when it is something so significant to me, so destructive to me, so harmful to me, that it has ruptured our relationship. And so the goal of forgiveness is first and foremost to restore your relationship to yourself. Again, the psychological research states that we don't do forgiveness for other people. We do forgiveness for ourselves. It is a healing that we offer and perform for ourselves. It doesn't demand reconciliation. It doesn't demand that we ever, the prison population, very common, I won't say very common, it's not uncommon for the victim, the person who was the victim of the crime, to find a pathway to forgiving the perpetrator. They may never tell the perpetrator that that's what happened. They don't have to reconcile with the perpetrator in order to feel like, oh, well then now we've completed the circle. And that's one of those areas culturally where we've done the forgive and forget, and which means that therefore we can be reconciled with whomever it is that wronged us. And in the science of forgiveness, that's not a requirement. That's not a part of the forgiveness. It may happen, but it doesn't have to happen in order for forgiveness to happen. And in fact, the forgiveness that I want to seek is so that I'm no longer burdened with what it is you have done. A saying that I have that I've formulated is, that which you cannot forgive is that which you are doomed to become.
So there's some institutions, the law, churches, which have formalized methods for forgiveness or reconciliation, whatever the right word is, the three we want to choose. And maybe some people are living without that kind of structured or institutional help, and that makes it harder for them to solve these problems. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I do think that's the case. As one aspect, I think also, when you were speaking, I was thinking about seeking forgiveness and how nuanced that process is when part of that needs to be your ability to forgive yourself. And I think, again, the population I have the most contact with are people that find it very hard to forgive themselves. So I think they don't think they deserve to ask for forgiveness from a victim's family or from their own family. And that's not true of everybody, but I think you see that percolating in the population, and it's easier to be tolerant of and forgiving of the people in their prison community because they recognize in themselves the difficulties in getting to that place where they feel worthy of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but
I think we're all saying some of the same thing. We're using different words, I think, but in my way of looking at things, I don't see forgiveness as the issue so much as what I call just kind of, you kind of accept some of the reality, and so that if we don't agree, it's okay that we don't agree. What I see happening with people is this demandingness. It's a pointing fingers at others. You did wrong, you need to, whatever, apologize, change, and those kinds of things. And all I'm suggesting in my therapy with people is we don't have control over that. Those people might decide to apologize, they might decide to change. But if they do or they don't, we are still responsible for having our lives be worthwhile. And so that's really a focusing on me. We had a conflict. I'd like us to clear this up, but I don't have control over your end of it. So I can offer to try to do that, but if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. If I trouble myself about the fact that you will not work with me, that just makes my life worse. So I'm not accepting in the sense of saying, yeah, it's okay that you don't. I prefer you did. But if you don't, I'm going to go on and have my life be good in any case, because that's what I can control, what I do and think and say. And so I don't need forgiveness from you. I don't need that. That would be nice. Maybe it would help us heal and get together and be able to have a relationship. But if it doesn't happen, I'm still going to need to go on with my life and have it be as good as I can. So this is kind of where I come in. We need to manage our life and our expectations, do the best we can to be forgiving and tolerant and so forth. But the other person's going to do what they're going to do. So I'm going to take responsibility to forgive you, to be tolerant. Whether you do or not, I don't have control of.
You have some specific guidelines. I'm now sitting at you're my uncle, my brother, my whatever, and we're getting together. We live 1,000 miles apart, and now we're sitting across the table from one another at a holiday dinner. Are there some specific guidance of gestures I should avoid, words I should not use, words I should use, you never do this, you always do this, maybe phrases like that that I ought to steer clear of to help make this go easier for us?
Right. First is to absolutizing anything always is a problem,
Right.
as I absolutize that statement. Don't say you always, you never. Allowing the grace of difference. I think it's also what Dick is saying. You have your perspective. So I don't, and family gatherings, the best advice is probably don't talk about the things that are going to get people upset. There's no point. Again, underlining what Dick was just saying. We aren't going to change your mind. If you're my arch-conservative uncle and I'm the wild-eyed hippie, we are not going to find a meeting of the minds. So let's talk about how wonderful the turkey is.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can always find, I think that's the key. You find your common goals. When you were talking about how many choices people have and when people make bad choices, things settle in. Again, in the prison environment, you don't have a lot of choices, right? You have, the average person makes something like 28,000 choices in a day, and in a carceral setting, that number is down below 6,000 because you don't get to choose when you go to sleep, you don't get to choose what you eat. But I think that also brings some clarity, and I think you can decide to see more of your similarities. You can see where you have meetings of the minds as opposed to recognizing that those differences aren't going to go away or be resolved over Thanksgiving dinner.
Probably not.
And so maybe it's okay to talk about a great book that we both enjoyed, or a TV program that we like, or how great the turkey is.
Yeah. And that understanding that mundane issues are not worth ratcheting up to the point of conflict. And at some level, the politics of the day or those kinds of issues are not worthy of the kind of harm. Where we get into the forgiveness piece is when I make that perspective so critically important that you cease to be another human being to me. You are simply a representative of something I hate. That's when I will cause a sufficient wound that then the other person may have to participate in the forgiveness. Again, forgiveness is not a reciprocal process. It's not a relational process. For the incarcerated folk who is the perpetrator, the hard part is I have to figure out how to forgive myself for an action that I did. The person on the victim may or may not choose to forgive, but if I'm going to make that experience of imprisonment a worthwhile experience, one that changes me, I'm going to have to find that pathway.
You may not reach your goal ever, any goal, but if you take responsibility for doing what you can, then you can rest on that and not feel like, okay, I was a part of the problem. But with regard to these interactions, like at Thanksgiving or whatever, almost any interaction that's of a nature of a relationship, avoid risky things. It's the doctor joke. The doctor joke says, a guy goes to the doctor and says, hey doc, it hurts when I do this. And the doctor says, well, don't do that. It's a silly joke, but it works in therapy. Mm-hmm. So if talking with my brother Ron about, automobiles is something we're going to don't talk about that. If drinking 3 glasses of wine puts me in a position where I spout off, don't do that. I mean, I think we know what the problems are, acknowledge it, and just try to avoid that just for the day so we can all have a good time. I agree. You are not going to settle a long-standing problem with your uncle. It ain't going to happen. So let's just make it pleasant.
Okay.
Yeah. Everybody has to be on board with that, though.
Well, yeah, I suppose that's right.
So in another discussion here on this program, we talked about how electronic technologies have changed interactions, especially among the young adults that you're working with and that you're working with, but not as students, as a classroom instructor. So you may have seen these books and articles that claim things have changed greatly in the last 10 years with the advent of smartphones, with the advent of social media. In an earlier discussion, we talked about maybe making this discussion about forgiveness when you can't forget. Everything's written down, everything's recorded. Any comments on that? Is the world different now because we're communicating in a different way and because we're recording everything permanently there? It's on the web, everybody can see it, and we can't erase it.
Yes, I think the answer is yes. But not so much in the fact that we can't get rid of it. We don't pay it. We've lost memory with the advent of all of these tools. We haven't gained memory. The bigger problem is that, and there's, again, good science is rapidly providing us evidence that our interaction, our mediating all of our relationships through different devices is in fact limiting our ability to have relationships.
Yep.
The brain is not forming the connections that it needs to form in order to read the face signals, to know that, oh, that eyebrow going up means interest or mad, or we don't know how to, our kids don't know how to do that. They're losing the ability.
I would agree with that. I was thinking the same thing. I have my two youngest are 9 and 11, and they both have smartphones, and they're not quite at the junior high teenage years where they're fully absorbed in it, but we do work hard to make sure that they interact. I mean, I think that it's not necessarily that things can't be forgotten, it's just that interactions aren't taking place, so you're not being proximate to the people in your life, so you're not interacting and dealing with them in a way that would provide any opportunity to even have a conflict, let alone forgive it. But then I think on the other side, with my students in prison who don't have access to any of that technology, they can sort of, so I think it's interesting to think about life going by for their families, and maybe it manifests in terms of news stories or something that does exist for a long time, but is not readily accepted or seen by that person.
Well, we've reached the end of our 30 minutes together. If you want to say one word, each of you, to say goodbye to our audience, advice maybe to those who are seeking an apology and those who want to reach out and offer forgiveness. One word at the end, maybe? No? Okay.
Take care of yourself. Do what you believe is correct, and you can walk away feeling like I did my part. I wasn't part of the problem.
And I think find common ground.
Okay.
Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is learning how to remember differently.
Very good. Thank you for joining us today in this conversation. Thank you all also for joining us today on Ethical Perspectives on the News, and we hope to see you at our next program. Thank you. Goodbye.